Um, just wanted to say that I'm really excited to have a chance for you all to meet Pete. I've known Pete long before either of us were really that much of scientists. I've known Pete for, I guess, almost 30 years now. Um, yeah.
At
Both,
least.
yeah, yeah, since the very early 90s, maybe 1991 is when I might have met
Hmm.
you. When we were musicians, I've been able to help Pete come to Maine a little bit. I love opportunities to see him. Um, he's taught a couple Jan plans here at Colby the past few years, which have been very popular courses. I'm sad that I've never been able to sit in on them myself because I'm always teaching one during that time. But Pete is an epidemiologist who teaches at University of Michigan. He did, for those who logged in early, they might have heard that Pete did everything at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He really loves Ann Arbor, apparently. Can't escape it. Um, yeah, his undergrad is, he has 3 degrees from Michigan. Although he is an exceptionally well traveled individual, he is a polyglot. He speaks Japanese and what Kenyan language do you speak?
Luo.
Okay. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah,
he,
English is my best.
yeah. Well, but he's lived in Japan for quite a while. He lived in Kenya, where he was a professor for several years as well. But, and I think the story you're going to tell us today is actually based in Africa. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. In Kenya.
Yeah.
Most of my research in Kenya.
Okay. Well, Pete, I am so glad that you're here to talk to us today. And with that, I am going to disappear and let Pete take over.
Yeah, I'm also extremely excited to be here. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to hang out with everyone. So, like Tom said, I'm Pete Larson, and I'm here at the University of Michigan. I'm have a joint appointment in the School of Public Health, and I also work at the Institute of Social Research. I mainly do. I've been transferred or sort of shifted over to more domestic things recently, working in Detroit on housing quality and asthma and pollen exposures. But before that, I spent approximately 10 plus years working in and out of sub-Saharan Africa, mostly in Kenya, where I was based in Nairobi, working for for Nagasaki University from Japan, who has a research station there, and with the Kenya Medical Research Institute. And so while I was there, I ran what's called a demographic health surveillance system, and we monitored about 120,000 people on a quarterly basis for births, deaths, migrations, pregnancies, did malaria surveillance, HIV, schistosomiasis, a bunch of other things. And one of the things I did while I was there was I did this project on snakebites, which I got really excited about. And I hope that you'll see why this is so exciting. So what I'd like to do now is share my screen, now that I can actually do so. Let's see, can you see a PowerPoint? Yep, okay, great. So I'm going to leave the sidebar open because I like to know where I'm going with my PowerPoints so I don't get lost. That's why you're seeing Microsoft up here. So again, thanks for having me. And today, what I'm going to talk about is snake bites, and specifically snake bites in Kenya. And the subline is geographic distribution, victims profiles, and health-seeking behaviors. And this is all for a paper that we've submitted and it's under review to Tropical Medicine International Health. So snakes are super cool. I didn't really have an appreciation for how cool they really are until I went to Kenya and started interacting with the locals. And if you mention snakes in sub-Saharan Africa, you're guaranteed to get a reaction. People in sub-Saharan Africa universally fear snakes, fear and respect snakes. They're associated with mortality, severe disease, with witchcraft, with connections with the next world, with general danger, all kinds of things. And it's really quite fascinating. So this is black mamba that's found in Kenya. You can look at the picture, it's incredibly beautiful. Snakes are just fascinating creatures in their own right. They sort of get maligned because they're associated with danger, but they're just cool animals in general. So, but the question is snake bites. Why should we really care about it? Here in the U.S., we hear about snake bites, but we don't really think of ourselves necessarily at risk for being bitten by a snake. And I wouldn't say that most Americans are really afraid of dying from a snake bite. Sort of the thinking is that you get bit and you can go to the clinic or hospital, whatever, and get some drugs and sort of move on your way. But venomous snakes and poisonous snakes, there is a species of poisonous snake, are found throughout the globe in most places. 6.5 billion people around the world live in some proximity to medically important snake species. And just as a byline, snakes are venomous because they inject a venom into your body. Poisons are usually in the flesh and cause sickness when they're consumed. And there's only one species of snake, the garter snake, which is actually poisonous if consumed by mammals. Most are venomous. 5.4 million people are bitten every year by snakes. There are 2.7 million what we call envenomings. Most snake bites don't actually result in envenoming because most snakes are not actually venomous. Some just bite as a defensive mechanism. And other even venomous snakes bite but don't actually inject venom because they'll bite for numerous reasons. The first being that they want to get food to eat. And if they're biting purely as a defensive measure to get you to go away, they're not necessarily going to want to waste their venom making you go away, unless it's really needed, unless it's absolutely necessary. That being said, there are about 81,000 to 138,000 deaths from snake bites every single year, and many times more than that in amputations and permanent disabilities. So you can see this is a serious problem on the same level as many other tropical infections, for example. Around the world, when you look at the map, medically important snake species throughout the world, they're everywhere, all over the place. Obviously absent from places like Alaska or Greenland or famously Ireland. Madagascar doesn't have any medically important snakes, but generally speaking, around the world, most people live in some proximity to some snake that could cause some sort of medical condition. But when we look at snakebite risk, the risk of actually being bitten, most risks for snakebite are actually concentrated in developing countries and mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that all over sub-Saharan Africa, people, there's large numbers of people who are at risk for being bitten by snakes. And then when you go up to countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, then you also see risk up there. So primarily afflicts poor countries. When we look at deaths, we see a similar pattern. Very few deaths in developed countries like our own, but large numbers of deaths in countries like India, for example, New Guinea, and down in sub-Saharan Africa. So snake bites are sort of the sort of classic tropical disease in many ways. The primary populations that are at risk live in poor countries. It is often the poorest of the poor within those countries who are at risk, and treatments are often unavailable or non-existent. Snake venoms are super cool. They are all over the place. Every single species has its own different cocktail of proteins and enzymes that does its own specific things. There's 4 specific classes of snake venomins: proteolytic, hemotoxic, neurotoxic, cytotoxic, and species of snakes can be in one of those categories or multiple categories. This is just an example. Here's a cobra of snake venoms in cobras, and the different sort of outcomes that can happen when you're envenomed by a cobra. It's all over the place. Some snakes are more dangerous than others. Some snakes result in different pathologies than others. It's really all over the map. And this is one of the things that makes treating snake bites very complicated. In contrast to other diseases, where be like one drug sort of fits all, or antibiotics, can cover, multiple different types of bacteria. Snake bite antivenoms often are restricted to particular species of snakes. And so with all of the different species of venomous snakes around the world, you can see how this would get really complicated really quickly in making these drugs available. Snake venoms affect the body in different ways. Neurotoxins affect the nervous system, causing paralysis, nausea. And the idea here is that the snake has to paralyze its food to be able to consume it. So snakes, will paralyze a rodent or whatever, and then go ahead and consume it. Hemotoxins cause red blood cells to burst. Muscular system myotoxins keep muscle cells from contracting properly. These are mostly to allow consumption of prey. And then cytotoxic venoms are really the scariest of all of them. And we're going to see some examples of that in a second. And if you have questions, please blurt out. I'm just hanging out here on a Friday afternoon. So treatments. What do you do with a patient that's been bitten? Antivenoms are sort of a standard treatment for most snake bites. So, for example, if you get bit by a rattlesnake here in the States, you get sent to the hospital, and there will be antivenoms available to treat you for that snake bite. These tend to be extremely expensive. So, for example, a treatment for a rattlesnake bite can run, over $100,000 for a full course. And the problem, generally speaking, is that snake bites impact the poorest countries in the world, and they affect the poorest people in those poorest countries in the world. When we look at overall burden of snake bites, sub-Saharan Africa is definitely the highest. Over 500,000 envenomings every single year, greater than 20,000 deaths, compared to someplace like North America, which has 5,000, mostly in the Pacific Southwest, and 5 deaths, very few. And then second is over in Asia, and a lot of that's concentrated in India and Bangladesh. Treatment is complicated by being in a suitable habitat for snakes. And this is from a really cool paper out of the Lancet from a couple years ago. And there's sort of 3 rings that you can be in. There's no antivenom available. Quality healthcare can be of poor quality, or healthcare can be accessible. And if you happen to be within all three of those zones, then you're somewhat out of luck if you get bitten by a snake. Generally speaking, health facilities in Kenya do not necessarily have access to antivenoms, and they're often giving sort of palliative care or care for subsequent possible bacterial infections at the wound site. And often that's the best that people can hope for. Fortunately, most snake bites actually don't result in death. And with the risk of death is actually fairly low compared to the number of bites. But if a serious case does appear, then treatment options are extremely limited. So what I want to talk about today is snake bites in general, but I also want to talk about what we did myself in cooperation with local teams and with a couple students that we had in Kenya at the time. So here is sub-Saharan Africa. Here is Kenya. Kenya is in East Africa. It's a wonderful country in East Africa, sandwiched between Tanzania and Somalia, and Ethiopia on the north border, South Sudan and Uganda. It's a country of about 42 million people, comprising about 42 plus ethnic groups. There are as many as 49 languages spoken in Kenya. It was colonized by the Brits and gained independence back in 1963, I believe, if I got my year correct, and is a sort of, I wouldn't say it's a developing country anymore. It's a low sort of middle income country at this point. Nairobi is extremely well developed, sophisticated, modern city. In the rural areas, it's sort of what you think of when you think of rural sub-Saharan Africa. And it can be very poor out in the countryside, not as bad as some other places. I worked along Lake Victoria, which is in Mbita here. You see the blue around it, that's Lake Victoria, which is an inland lake in East Africa, and also in Kwale on the Kenyan coast. These two regions are quite different. Kwale is Islamic and primarily Digo and Duduma groups. And Mbita is Christian and primarily occupied by Luo people out there. And I can't think of two more different areas of Kenya. They're really radically different places. They're similar in the sense that they're both rural and people are mostly doing subsistence agriculture. Obviously in Mbita, they're doing fishing and exporting fish that way. Kwale, there's a little bit of tourism. Really wonderful places. I highly recommend going there. Snakes in Kenya. Kenya is home to about 130 to 170 species of snakes, and that's out of 600 species of snakes in the world. So the biodiversity among snakes in Kenya is pretty overwhelming. Approximately 21 of these species of snakes are venomous. And venomous species include some of the worst that you can think of, like puff adders, which is extremely dangerous snake, black-green mambas, spitting cobras, and boomslangs. These snakes are universally feared among people in Kenya. I can remember when I was out in the field once, I found this black mamba just eaten to death. I was in pieces, there's pieces of it all over the place. Some of the field teams had found it in the morning. The snake was just sort of minding its own business, going somewhere, and they freaked out and started cutting it into pieces with a shovel. And this is sort of the general reaction that people have towards snakes in Kenya. You kill them on sight. That being said, most snakes are not aggressive towards humans. They bite when threatened or when stepped on. It's often the conditions of people being bitten is they're out collecting firewood or something and happen to step on a snake that's basking, trying to get warm, and then they get bit. Why would this be? Kenya is home to large numbers of what we call charismatic megafauna, for example, elephants. And so snakes, in order to avoid being stepped on or eaten by lions, for example, have adapted to be incredibly venomous to large animals and to humans, very, very deadly. So it's no accident. Kenya's complicated ecology has incentivized animals to become bigger because of predators, and also for snakes to become more dangerous. So I've already talked a little bit about this, about where we conducted our study. Ran a health and demographic surveillance system covering approximately 100,000 people, 120,000 people in 2 regions of Kenya, approximately halfway divided between each site. Both locations are generally rural areas with similar levels of poverty and deprivation, but very, very different sociocultural and environmental profiles. Kwale is distinct in that there is a large wildlife park there, the Shimba Hills National Preserve, and people live right up against that park. And elephants and warthogs and everything else are free to come out of the park into areas that humans live. Humans enter the park all the time. There's a lot of crosstalk between this wildlife reserve and places where people live. And so that existence of a complex ecology puts people at higher risk for encounters with wild snakes. So the survey was conducted in sort of 2, I would say 3 parts. The principal part of the survey was a house-to-house survey where teams visited each household directly as part of their regular activities. And we would go to the houses all the time anyway and, ask, did you have, was there a baby born in this household in the past 3 months? Did anyone die in this household in the past 3 months? Is anyone newly pregnant? Have there been any cases of malaria? Have any of you, been afflicted with parasitic fleas in the past 3 months? And we added questions about snake bites in one of the rounds. And this is something that no one had done in this area before. People just hadn't really thought about doing it. And this is one of the reasons I did it, was when I go out into the villages and talk to people, people would mention snake bites, oh, such and such person, got bitten by a snake, blah, 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 blah. And, oddly, it was never on our list of things to watch out for as part of the Kenyan Ministry of Health. And so I was like, well, why don't we set up a survey and start asking people about this and see exactly how bad this problem could be. We're already asking about, malaria and all these things. I think snake bite is important too. So we did it. We went up to household heads and, did the regular survey and said, would you like to answer a few questions about snakes? And the reason we had to be a little bit careful about it is because there is still some stigma around snake bites, especially in Kwale, in this area. Because of its association with witchcraft and malevolent spirits. And some people kind of don't want to talk about it. And so we had to be a little bit careful about it. But, fortunately, we found that most people were like, yeah, sure, I'll talk about it. And so we asked, had anyone been bitten in this household in the past 5 years? And if they said yes, then we did a follow-up survey. And it was either with the person who had been bitten, if that person was still around, through a proxy of a person who knew the person, or a proxy if the person had actually died, and collected different information on bite conditions, what were they doing, when they got bitten, severity of the bite, did they have scarring, nausea, did they die, all these different questions about what actually happened with the bite. And what they did upon being bitten. And so that was one of the things we were interested in, is what do people actually do when they're bitten? Do they go to a traditional healer? Do they go to the formal health facility? Do they try and treat it on their own? This is one of the main things that we're interested in. After that, Noriko, one of our students, went out and started doing interviews with the local community people about community attitudes towards snake bites and their experience of snake bites, and also went and interviewed health practitioners, including traditional healers, to try and find out more about what happens when people are bitten and seek treatment. And to me, this is like where things got really fascinating. It's really getting out there and talking to people and hearing their stories of snake bites. And, you know, it was really overwhelming because it was far more of a problem than anyone sort of expected. You know, everybody knew somebody that got bitten by a snake, and then you'd be like out in the village and, you know, we're doing this thing of snake bites, and some guy running out, he's like, yeah, I got bitten by a snake. And he'd pull up his leg and show you, you know, his leg and show you the scar or whatever, tell you all about it. So it got to be really fascinating. Yeah, very much in thanks to people like this lady here who, you know, like act as a translator, you know, and go between people out there. We went out and asked questions. So, what is the extent of the problem? Well, these were households. So we had approximately 17,981 households total that were included in the survey. We had a few refusals, people who didn't want to talk about snake bites or just weren't around. But we found that total of both of our DSSs, 3% of households had reported having someone in the household who had been bitten by a snake in the past 5 years. And that was 5% in Quale and 1% in Abita. We found that in general, you know, people were about 4 kilometers away from health facility, healthcare in Quale, and 2 kilometers away from a facility in Abita. And then, since we found that some households had snakebite victims, we wanted to learn more about those victims. So we went and tracked some of them down, and this is what we found. Here's a kid. He was at the time, he was approximately 12 years old. He had been bitten by a puff adder approximately 3 years before. Nearly all of the muscle tissue in his left arm is gone from the single bite. He underwent a series of skin grafts, spent approximately a year in the hospital, having surgeries and receiving care, and it's amazing that he did not die. The arm is mostly useless at this point, just because of all of the tissue and nerve damage that occurred throughout his arm, but he's simply lucky to have his life, let alone an arm. Outside of his arm, he really doesn't have any problems. He was just like any other bright, 12-year-old kid. But this, sort of shows you of how serious this can really be for people in this area. This is from one bite. He was out collecting wood with his mother, and reached into a pile of twigs or whatever, and a puff adder was in that pile and bit him. And it took all of a couple milliseconds for this to happen. Here's a guy who we found, he had been bitten by an unidentified snake several years before. He still has scarring on his skin. He claims that he has lost feeling in his lower leg. And that, there's like tingling feeling. And the way he described it, he's like, I have snakes under my skin. And obviously there's no way to have snakes under your skin, but this is how he perceived it. And he was willing to talk about it. He walked somewhat with a limp. Fortunately, he still can use the leg, unlike that poor boy in Quale. Here's a 72-year-old lady in Quale who was also out collecting wood and was bitten by a puff adder while out. This wound is about 25 years old. She has to still wrap it to this day to keep it from being infected. She walks with a limp, with a cane. She spent approximately 2 years in a hospital, off and on intravenous antibiotics. And it's just absolutely incredible that she's alive. Like, fascinating. And she attributed her survival to Jesus Christ. A man came into the hospital and converted her over to be a Seventh-day Adventist, and she claims that that's what helped her along. So, point here is that these bites can be very severe. People's experiences of these bites can be extremely varied, and inevitably there's some kind of religious component that goes along with it. Somebody going to say something? Heard something? No?
I did have a question, actually.
Absolutely.
So she still has to wrap it. So then, is the wound like continuing to stay open all those years later? Like, is the venom still present in the foot?
No, venom's gone. She just she probably has received inadequate care, and if she had a series of skin grafts, might have the problem taken care of. I don't quite know. Obviously, she couldn't really describe in medical terms what was going on, and I wasn't going to ask her to take the wrap off so we could look at it. But she said that fluid comes out occasionally, and has to change these bandages daily. But no, there'll be no venom at this point. Cool. Thank you for that. So that was all fascinating to find, to talk to people on the ground, and sort of hear about individual experiences was really the most fascinating part of this project, because, it's all over the place. Like, when you hear people's stories and the way they frame it, the way they sort of perceive what happened, they perceive like the conditions leading up to the bite incident, and everything after the bite is just absolutely fascinating. But we also wanted to conduct more formal quantitative analyses of this data. And so we had GPS lat-long coordinates from each of the households that we surveyed as part of our regular data collection activities. And so we're able to map out where these bites were occurring. Are there going to be particular places that are a higher risk than other areas of these two regions that we're working in? And so this map here was just kind of a quick and dirty exploratory map we did of cases of snake bites in Quale. And the yellow dots, or green, or whatever color it is, were mostly concentrated here in the center. Here's a little lake here. Here's the forest. We expected there would be more bites along the forest area, but that didn't actually turn out to be the case. They tended to be around these drier, more arid, sort of low-lying areas where lots of people live, and where there isn't a whole lot of water. So that was interesting. We also conducted what's called a hotspot analysis. And this allows us to find statistically significant clusters of bites within these areas. And we found, of course, the same thing, that there was a significant cluster, where all the bites were occurring. And then there were areas where bites almost never happened at all. And so even in this area, not everyone lives at the same level of risk. There's actually areas where people live at very high risk for bites. In Mbita, in the other area we worked in, there were obviously fewer cases of snake bites in this region, and we found it to be a little more sporadic in terms of where the bites were. Quale was really dramatic to us. That there were there was a chunk of area where people lived, where many people were getting bitten over and over again. So what's a scientific PowerPoint without a table that you have to digest? This is comparisons of households with and without snake bites. And I've got it organized here, Quale in this set of columns, and then Mbita in this set of columns. There's a yes column for there was a snake bite in that household. And there's a no column when there was no snake bite in that household in the past 5 years. And we found that things didn't necessarily vary a whole lot on socioeconomics. We did find, however, that households that reported having bites tended to be farther away from areas where they could potentially receive medical care. So, for example, here in Quale, the household that reported having a bite at some point in the past 5 years was 4.73 kilometers away from the nearest health facility, compared to the households that reported no bites, which is only 3.41 kilometers away. Among victims, people were actually bitten. We found that gender did not matter. This was kind of surprising to me. I figured that sort of suspected that women might be at higher risk for bites, given that they are often doing all of the work, gathering firewood, water, farming, and men are often they often leave the area for labor opportunities elsewhere. But we found that it didn't really matter. Somewhat slightly more men were bitten in our sample, but it wasn't statistically significant. Bites tended to happen in the dry season rather than the rainy season. And this was when we started talking to people, this was less surprising when we found out that during the dry season, snakes like to come out and bask in the sun. During the rainy seasons, they tend to hole up in burrows to get away from the rains. Remember, they are reptiles. They cannot produce their own heat. Locations of incidents tend to be in the fields surrounding the house. So people are going out gathering firewood, doing agricultural activities, and get bitten when they step on a snake, or they just happen upon a snake and the snake feels threatened. Or as we found out, people are trying to kill the snake and end up getting bitten. Locations of bites tend to be concentrated on the foot and leg, as we suspected. Snakes will bite opportunistically wherever they can. Obviously, the feet and the legs are the easiest places to get. We did find in our death database that we had an infant who was bitten on the head and later died of the wound from a snake entering the home. Fortunately, that's a rare occurrence. Mostly foot, leg, mostly people out gathering wood, doing agricultural activities, and mostly in the dry season. We put pictures of snakes on a piece of paper and showed them to them because we were interested in, like what kind of snake were you bitten by? And this has to be taken with a grain of salt. I don't, know that a lot of times people didn't see the snake that actually bit them. They felt it, but the snake was gone before they actually saw it. And people's ability to discern certain snakes from other snakes is maybe not ideal. But we found that most people reported getting bitten by what we identify as black mambas. And we compared deaths between the different species of snakes and found that puff adders were the ones most associated with death and severe injury. William, Mr. Wilson, yeah.
So my question is I know a black mamba is considered to be the most deadly snake. So is this kind of showing the difference between, or showing the snake's ability to monitor or regulate the amount of venom that they're releasing upon bite?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I don't have an answer to that. When we talk about death, in Kenya at least, puff adders were actually the most dangerous because it is a cytotoxic venom. Tissues do tend to liquefy more or less, and then people are dying of secondary bacterial infections from there. The neurotoxic venoms, this paralysis, and found that deaths were actually quite low. And so I think to answer your question, I think it might depend less on the amount of venom that the snake is injecting into the body, and more the type of venom it is and the way it acts on the body, if that answers your question.
So are most of the deaths then due to secondary infections, not actual venom?
Yeah, that's kind of what we found. And then we were talking to people at the health facilities, and they were like, most times that people actually die is because the tissue damage is so extensive, and then the facilities can't manage all the bacterial infections that result from that. So I have to point out, like, deaths, among snake bites is actually quite low. It only represented about, there's only about a 2% death rate amongst bites. This is kind of the thing with snake bites is most snake bites are actually not all that serious. The snake will bite to get you to run away or to like get you to stop stepping on it. And so like it has sort of implications with the way people view snake bites. So like if you just get bit by a snake and nothing serious happens, then it's not really associated with witchcraft or any of that kind of thing. But if it's a really serious bite, which is a really rare occurrence, then people start, sort of suspecting that something else is going on to make it that severe for you. So, I mean, that's somewhat of a tangent, but the point is that snake venoms vary by snake. The reactions that humans have to venoms varies by snake. Hope that answers your question. Okay. So treatment seeking. This is the other question that we had was like, the best thing to do when you get bit by a snake is to go to a formal health facility. Absolutely, hands down, immediately. And this is, like when we talk about puff adder bites and people dying of secondary bacterial infections, it really pays to get to the hospital as soon as you can to start having them administer antibiotics to you to prevent infection. Delays in treatment can result in delays in more severe disease. So we started asking them, well, what do you do when you get bitten by a snake? And so, 50% of people reported that they would go to a formal facility. And then 50% of people said they would go to a traditional healer. And if they went to a formal facility, often they were given some kind of drugs. People obviously, couldn't really identify what kind of drugs they were given. They might have just been given Panadol, like Tylenol kind of thing. If they go to the traditional healer, they're often given herbs. So it's sort of one of two things. And often we found that people often do both. And what we found was that the first sort of stop on the road to treatment is the traditional healer. People will go to the healer because it's probably somebody they're related to, they know, and probably somebody that's living next door. And then after the healer, they might go to the formal facility or they might not. And so this brought up the question of what are the traditional healers doing? Like we know what the formal facility is doing. That's all documented. And we were already working with the ministry anyway. And so we'd say, well, what are these traditional healers doing actually? If this is the first stop on the road. And so I had a friend of mine hook me up with one of the local healers, and he agreed to sit down and let me interview him. And I don't go in, with any sort of judgment on what he does. He's, another sort of health provider like any other. And to be fair, here in the U.S., people often will go to, psychics or like faith healers or, homeopaths or, all these different kinds of things first as well. So it's worth taking them seriously and asking what they have to say. So I sat down with him, a really nice guy, and asked him what he did. And he says, well, when the patient comes in, I first apply the Nijue Nanjoka, which is a snake stone. The stone sucks all the poison out of the wound. When you put it on the bite, it will stick. when the stone has absorbed all the poison, it will fall off. And that's exactly what's going on in this picture. This is a boy who got bit on the leg. He was fine, didn't have any sort of severe problems. He went to the facility, went to the healer, and the healer put this snake stone on him, which is really just a piece of charcoal, and tied on to the wound with a piece of fabric like this. And then often what they do is they'll give herbs and medicine, and what they'll do is they'll mix in this snake powder in with the herbs. And I was like, what is the snake powder about? What's in it? And he's like, when we kill a snake, we keep the heads to make the powder. We mix it with root, barks, and leaves from special plants from deep in the forest. My teacher is a security guard in one of the forests and can get them where he can find them. Now, it has to be noted that it's illegal to go in the forest, to get these things. It's also illegal to use wildlife products in medicines in Kenya. But the teacher, the master traditional healer, is a security guard in the forest, and so he, has access to these things and collects it and then distributes among the other healers in the village. So they take the heads and dry it and make a powder out of it. And then I was like, so what's the deal with witchcraft and these snake bites? Like, tell me about that. And he says, there are two kinds of bites. Those where the snake just bites and there is no witchcraft, and those where someone has used magic to send the snake to bite you. If the bite heals quickly, there is no witchcraft. And this is what I was talking about, like the mild bites. But if the bite is treated and does not improve, then there is definitely witchcraft involved. At that time, I have to use powerful magic to get rid of the curse. This was absolutely fascinating. So basically what he's saying is that, like, if he uses this treatment, the snake stone, for example, that actually doesn't do anything at all, and the bite gets worse, then you have to go get treated for this set of spiritual problems. So it sort of leads you into this cycle of receiving, ever more treatments, from this healer. So it's sort of a self, propagating business in that sense. So if the stone works, then, you just kind of go on your way. But if stone doesn't work, then you got to come back. And then you got to deal with the spiritual problems. And this can lead to months and months and months of repeat visits, because, how do you know that your spiritual problems are solved? So this is really fascinating to me. I sort of asked him, why this would happen. And he said, well, people have disputes in the villages. And so, they'll put a curse on someone they don't like. But the problem is if you put a curse on somebody, then there's sort of a bounce back effect that you open yourself up to being cursed as well. So it leads to a cycle of curses in the villages. And it was really incredibly fascinating. So the question was, what were snakebite outcomes like for people who received treatment from a traditional healer? So we asked. So people who visited the traditional healer were less likely to go to a formal health facility, presumably because traditional healer is cheaper, closer to you. And since most snake bites actually aren't all that severe to begin with, it might actually be enough. Problem, of course, is you don't know how bad the bite will be. It could be fairly mild at first and then get worse and worse. We found that visiting traditional healers was people were far more likely to experience scarring. So 21%, 22% of people who visited healers experienced scarring, compared to 3.28% who did not visit the traditional healer. These were among people who have been bitten. Deaths were approximately the same. There really wasn't much difference there statistically. And permanent injury was much worse amongst people who visited healers. And presumably this is due to delayed treatment. So conclusions from all this were, first, snake bites are really cool. Snakes are cool. I was really, in my career in public health, this was actually one of those fascinating projects I was ever involved in. I wish there was more funding for snake bites. I would do much more work with snake bites. Unfortunately, snake bites fits the classic definition of a neglected tropical disease, where it afflicts the poorest of the poor in the world and is extremely underfunded. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to continue my work in snake bites. I'm still looking for money. Snake bites are an underserved problem in rural Kenya, despite populations living at high risk for bites and severe outcomes. I found that these two regions are very different, sort of local ecologies contributing to risk of bites. I was extremely interested to find that snake bites didn't necessarily vary along socioeconomic and gender groups in these areas. Use of traditional healers in these areas are ubiquitous. It may cause delays in treatment, leading to more serious outcomes. And so this requires sort of a level of outreach to communities to get people into the health facilities when they're bitten. And access to formal treatment services is worse amongst those who are bitten than those who are not. To follow up, I want to give a huge shout out to all the people I worked with in Kenya. Here is my team in Kwale, and here's a graduate student who is out working with me, Michael Burbage from the University of Michigan. These people were awesome, just, absolutely a joy to work with, as always. Here's my friend Paul Diela from Mbita. This is the staged photo. We're posing. Paul was instrumental in getting this research done and working with teams to make it happen. So I want to give a big shout out to them. And I want to also give a big shout out to all y'all. Thanks a lot for having me today. And if you have any questions, then welcome. Thank you.
I have a question.
Please.
So are there any ideas about behaviors that could, that people could use that might reduce the risk of getting bitten in the first place?
That's a great question. One, idea we had was making access to other kinds of cooking fuel. For example, LP gas, different types of stoves, so they don't actually have to go out and collect wood all the time. That's usually the biggest problem, is that there's really no access to other kinds of cooking fuel here. So they're either collecting wood to burn directly, or they're collecting wood to make charcoal out of to use later. And this puts people at higher risk. With agricultural activities, it's difficult because they obviously have to grow food to eat. So there's challenges in making that happen. But definitely a switch to other kinds of cooking fuel would, I think, have an impact in reducing risk.
What about the antivenoms makes them so expensive? Is it just to do with the production or the distribution?
Yeah, and this is something I didn't know. So a lot of antivenoms are made with horses. So what they do is they inject the venom, a sort of like, diluted form of the venom into a horse, and then wait several months for the horse to develop antibodies to it. And then they pull blood out of the horse, and then they make the antivenom from it. So, I mean, from that, you can already, speculate how expensive and time-consuming this process is. And that has to be done for just about every species of venomous snake. So, the problem is compounded from there. Now, that being said, that's the traditional method. That being said, there's several synthetic antivenoms being in development right now. And some of those synthetic versions are being developed so they can cross, they can cover several different species of snake. So once we progress in the development of synthetic antivenoms, I think there's going to be a lot more better access to treatments for severe bites. But the horse thing really blew me away. I did not know that. those poor horses.
Are those antivenoms like differs due to the different types of venoms, like the cytotoxic or neurotoxic ones you mentioned before, and like how they're different in their component or structure?
Oh, that's a great question that I wish I had a good answer for, because I'm not that kind of epidemiologist. I can tell you that they're extremely complex in terms of the different kinds of proteins in each venom. They have different properties, just like you think of different, the complex properties of blood, for example, and the coagulant properties. Venoms are cocktails of all different kinds of things that do different stuff. Some paralyze, their prey. Some, turn their prey into a soup. Some, do other things to them. It's quite fascinating, and I wish I had a good answer for you on what the composition of venoms are, but unfortunately I don't, because that's just not the kind of epidemiologist I am. So I encourage you, for sure, please go out and explore this, and if you want, I can send you a couple papers on it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Tom asked me to ask you about your record label. Talk a little about your music. I don't want to shy away from the science, so if anybody else has a question about science.
So Tom's referring to I played music for decades, but when I was in Kenya, I studied. I learned how to play this lyre from this old man in Nairobi, and I put out Kenyan music. I put out music from Ghana. Put out music from everywhere. So I have sort of a dual life, science and music. Somewhat similar to Tom. Tom's kind of wacky in that way.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Well, cool. It's 1:59. I sincerely appreciate y'all having me. This has been really great interacting with y'all. And if you want to contact me for anything, please let me know. And if I come back for Jam Plan in January 2022, hope to run into some of y'all then.
Great talk. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure thing.